You're listening to Murder Not Murdering with Erin,
And Autumn,
a true crime podcast about murder and murdering.
but we are not murderers.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Murder Not Murdering with Erin. And this week, I am without my trusty podcast partner, Autumn, who's taking some time to grieve a loss in her family. I am sending so much love to Autumn and Dustin right now. But, listeners, I have something important to talk about. There is a phenomenon happening in Seattle right now, and I'm not sure if you've seen it, but if you haven't, Google Jimothy the raccoon. It is crazy. I have to say, I'm obsessed with this little guy. He was born with a spinal disorder, and despite that, he appears to be thriving in a Ballard neighborhood. He is round, he has long legs and a short, tiny tail, and he is taking this country by storm. The Reddit fan art is a fucking treasure trove. So if you haven't seen it, look it up. It's amazing. Anyway, speaking of Reddit, you can find us on there at Murder Not Murdering if you know any cases you'd like us to cover, or always slide into our DMs on Instagram. Anyways, also, I have true crime news. I'm full of things today. Anyway, I have true crime news that is blowing my brain. There is a documentary coming out soon. I don't know a date. I will keep you updated. That is about the Black Dahlia, Elizabeth Short's story. Now, I just did a case on the gay Black Dahlia is a completely separate case, but the 1940s Elizabeth Short case, which we all know, and I feel like it's been covered a million times. However, this documentary group has apparently found a bunch of new information. They went into a 1940s motel and asked them if they could cut open their walls, which they did do with the permission of the motel, and they found a bloody scene. Catastrophic blood loss all over in this boarded up area. They're saying that they believe that this is where Elizabeth Short was murdered. Because as you know, she was found, there was not any blood. She had been cut in half. I mean, there's so many more details that I'm not going to get into right now. But the fact is, no one ever knew where the crime scene was. So apparently, they're planning on proving that that is where she was murdered. And the documentary is going to come out. I am going to keep you all posted. I read about it in an article by People Magazine, but it's kind of been everywhere. If you follow true crime news, I'm sure you've seen it. But I can't wait to find out what more information they have for us on that. Now, we are speaking of that famous case, and my case that I'm doing today is probably the most famous case I have ever covered. As many of you know, I don't usually do that. I like old-timey, weird cases that you've never heard of. However, during the last episode when I was doing our Pride episode, I all month was researching a ton of cases, and a lot of things were coming up from the 1990s. Now, I'm a child of that era, right? And there's so many 90s true crime cases. We had tabloid headlines like crazy too at that time. There was the O.J. Simpson trial. There was Skategate with Nancy Kerrigan and Tanya Harding, Menendez brothers, John Benet Ramsey. There's just so many more cases like that. And it piqued my interest of a case I hadn't thought about in a really long time. That case, my case that I'm doing today, is the story that everyone thinks they know. And that is the story of Lorena Bobbitt. Now, before we begin, I want to let you know that this episode contains discussions of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner violence. Some details of this case are disturbing. Okay, are you ready? Because here we go. If you were alive in the summer of 1993, chances are you've heard the name Lorena Bobbitt. Even if you were too young to remember it firsthand, you've probably heard someone make a joke about it. For decades, her name became shorthand for revenge. It showed up in late night monologues, sitcoms, stand up routines, songs, cartoons, and even casual conversation. The phrase, "don't go full Lorena Bobbitt on me," became part of American pop culture. Most people only remember one image: a woman, a knife, and a severed penis. But that's not the actual story. Behind the headlines was a 24-year-old immigrant who said that she had spent years enduring physical, emotional, sexual, and financial abuse. There were two separate criminal trials, not one. I think everyone remembers the one, but there were two. There were witnesses, medical experts, police officers, and psychiatrists. There were acquittals in both cases. And there was a media machine that found it far more profitable to sell punchlines than to ask difficult questions about domestic violence or marital rape. This episode isn't about deciding who to believe based on emotion. It's about following the chronology, examining what was presented in court, and separating document facts from allegations. It's important to understand why this case became one of the defining media spectacles of the 1990s. Because once you remove the jokes, what's left is far more complicated and a far more tragic story. Lorena Gallo was born October 31st, 1970, in Ecuador. She was raised in a close knit family and spent much of her childhood in Venezuela, where her father worked as a dental technician. Friends and relatives would later describe Lorena as quiet, deeply religious, hardworking, and devoted to her family. She enjoyed school, dreamed of building a stable life, and like many young people, she hoped to move to the United States someday. In the 1980s, that opportunity came. Lorena immigrated to Northern Virginia, joining family members who had already settled there. Like countless immigrants before her, she was trying to build a new life in a new country. She worked hard. She learned English from ESL classes and also popular soap operas and The Price is Right. She had found employment at a local nail salon. Coworkers remembered her as dependable and soft spoken. Then she met John Wayne Bobbitt. John had been born in New York and raised in Western New York before eventually joining the United States Marine Corps. By the time he met Lorena, he had completed his military service and was living in Virginia. He was charismatic, outgoing, and by many accounts, charming when he wanted to be. The two met in 1988 at a local dance club. Like many relationships, theirs started quickly. Friends recalled that they appeared happy at first. John was attentive. Lorena believed she had found someone who wanted the same things that she did: marriage, stability, and a future together. They married on June 18th, 1989. Lorena was 18 years old, John was 22. For a brief time, their marriage seemed ordinary. They rented an apartment in Manassas, Virginia. Lorena continued working. John worked various jobs after leaving the Marines, though his employment was often inconsistent. Money became a frequent source of stress. Years later, Lorena would testify that the abuse began early in the marriage. She described arguments that escalated into pushing, hitting, and intimidation. She said John controlled much of the household's finances despite contributing inconsistently, often spending money while expecting her to cover the bills through her income at the nail salon. According to Lorena's later testimony, emotional abuse accompanied the physical violence. She said that John frequently insulted her appearance, belittled her English, and mocked her immigration status. He also threatened that no one would ever believe her if she reported him. Remember, he is a tall, illustrious man from the military, and she is just a lowly immigrant to him. So he said, "No one will believe you. Go ahead, try it." It's important to note that these descriptions have come from Lorena's testimony in later interviews. John has denied many of the allegations throughout the years. However, investigators and journalists later found that Lorena had spoken to friends, coworkers, and family members about her problems in her marriage before June 1993. Several witnesses testified that they had observed bruises or changes in her behavior. Others recalled hearing the arguments or seeing her become increasingly withdrawn. Those witnesses would later become significant because they suggested the concerns about the abuse didn't just suddenly appear after one incident that made international news. One of the realities that can be difficult to understand today is how differently domestic violence was viewed in the early 1990s. Protective laws existed, but enforcement was inconsistent. Public awareness campaigns were still developing. Many victims were asked why they stayed instead of why they were being hurt. Marital rape had only recently become a crime across the United States, and prosecution remained very uncommon. Cultural attitudes often treated violence between spouses as a private matter rather than a public crime. Many still struggled with the idea that a husband could rape his wife. For much of American history, marriage itself had been treated as an ongoing consent. The notion that a spouse could refuse sex and that forcing sex could be a crime was still being debated in courtrooms, legislatures, and public opinion. Lorena testified that John forced sex on her repeatedly throughout their marriage, both vaginally and anally. She described incidents where she had told him no, and she was ignored. She described feeling powerless, and she described believing that reporting the assaults would accomplish nothing. That context doesn't determine what happened inside the Bobbitt marriage, but it does help explain why Lorena felt so trapped. In 1993, male partners were responsible for over 4 million assaults per year. Over 2,000 women were killed by their intimate partners. There wasn't a domestic abuse hotline or federal funding yet for women's shelters. Women would literally have to be fighting for their lives to claim self-defense. The police would often just try to separate couples and then be on their way. There hadn't even been training in a domestic abuse cases yet. So they would show up, photograph what had happened, and then tell them to go to separate places. I mean, that's all they could do. So it was often difficult to feel safe. As the marriage continued, financial struggles worsened. John moved between jobs, bills accumulated. Lorena often worked long hours while trying to keep the household afloat. She later testified that despite contributing little financially at the time, John expected complete control over their money. Friends noticed she seemed exhausted. She would work late nights. Coworkers said that sometimes she arrived at work visibly upset. Still, she rarely discussed the details. Like many people experiencing abuse, those who knew her best would later say that they sensed something was wrong without fully understanding what was happening behind closed doors. Lorena was embarrassed. One neighbor overheard their fighting. In fact, many of the neighbors did. But one older woman talked to Lorena, and she told her about the forced sex as well as the abuse. As an abuse survivor, the neighbor brought the couple pamphlets on forced sex and marriage, rape, and abuse. The pamphlets were even photographed by the police as evidence on a table in their home the night of the incident. By 1992, John and Lorena Bobbitt had been married for 3 years. There was a growing instability inside their apartment. Years later, Lorena would testify that John frequently drank heavily. He disappeared for long stretches of time and returned home angry. She described episodes of physical violence that ranged from pushing to grabbing to hitting. John denies ever being an abuser. However, I will give you information that will contradict this. And this isn't a story of he said, she said. There is police report history. By early 1993, the marriage was unraveling. Friends described Lorena as withdrawn. Family members worried about her. Meanwhile, arguments between the couple intensified. Several accounts described repeated confrontations over finances, jealousy, and infidelity. Lorena believed John was seeing other women, and she was not wrong. John admitted to having extramarital affairs. The marriage was rapidly approaching a breaking point. Lorena finally had built up the courage to leave John. He claims that he was going to leave her because, of course, he did. She had gone as far as moving some of her things to a neighbor's house. The neighbor urged her not to stay at home that night, but Lorena, she still stayed. Knowing John was going out with his friend, a roommate that night, a man that John had moved into their home. Anyways, she decided he would just come home and probably pass out, and she wouldn't have to worry about him. So it's June 23rd, 1993, the day that began like many others. That evening, John spent time drinking with his friend. Accounts differ somewhat regarding exactly where he went and how much alcohol he consumed, but witnesses generally agree that alcohol was definitely involved. He claims he had very little to drink. However, the man with him said they were both wasted. Meanwhile, Lorena was working late. Again. She came home and she went to bed. Much later, around 3:15 a.m., John returned home. What happened next became one of the most contested portions of both trials. John testified that he came home, got into bed, and fell asleep. Lorena tells a very different story. She testified that after returning home, John came into their room, turned her body over, used no lubricant, and raped her anally. She said that she had told him no, and that she wasn't strong enough to get him off of her. He did say later that he remembered being on top of her and maybe pulling at her underwear, but that he never raped her or forced sex. What is known for certain is that after that encounter, John went to sleep. Lorena remained awake, and something inside her was unraveling. Years later, Lorena would describe feeling numb, detached, almost as though she was watching herself from outside her own body. Psychiatrists who later testified for the defense described her as suffering from severe emotional distress resulting from years of alleged abuse, PTSD. Everyone agrees on one thing. In the early morning hours of June 24th, 1993, Lorena got out of bed. She walked towards the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator, and the light illuminated an 8-inch carving knife. This is when Lorena stopped remembering what had happened that day. But we know what happened next. John was sleeping. She walked into the room and cut his penis off with shocking precision. Then she grabbed a few of her things while still holding the knife and the penis and left. Because John was intoxicated, or as he said, exhausted, he just laid there for a while. And then he finally called medics. In the meantime, Lorena was driving away. Realizing she was holding the 3-inch penis in her hand and the knife and trying to drive, she started to gather what had happened. She rolled the window down and tossed the penis into a field. Doctors at the hospital were prepping the OR for John, thinking that they would have nothing to reattach, and they were going to have to reroute his urethra. Lorena called the police, and she told them what had happened and where to find the penis. At first, and this is so weird, they thought she had eaten it. That is what they said. They thought she had consumed the penis. I don't know why, but that's what they interpret it as. And then she talked to them, told them where to find it. So the firefighters went to a grassy area near a 7-Eleven, and they found the penis in the grass. They argued about who was going to pick it up, which, come on, let's stop being childish here. Anyway, but instead, this part gets me. Listen, I'm not making fun of anything. It's really awful that anyone was hurt in any way in this entire case. Though John is a monster, it's not right to hurt other people. So, the firefighters did not have an evidence bag for some reason. I kid you not, they put the penis in a hot dog box on ice from 7-Eleven and rushed it to the hospital. Doctors called in a specialist because no one had reattached a penis before. Very few people had, and this surgeon hadn't, but nevertheless, he successfully reattached John's 3-inch penis. A detail I didn't know was that at the same time that John was in the hospital in the surgery room, Lorena was also there, being examined on the other side of the hospital for a rape kit. They did say that they didn't see evidence of rape, but that does not mean that it didn't happen. While being interviewed by police, Lorena said something that would become an anchor for both the media and the prosecutors. With English being her second language, when asked why she did it, she replied, "He had an orgasm and not me." She was trying to convey that she had been raped, but they spun it in a way that she had felt unsatisfied and cutting his penis off was an act of revenge. Remember, she was also in shock at the time. She had just been raped after years of abuse. She kind of came to, and there was a giant carving knife and a penis in her hand. It wasn't really the time or place to be interviewed. But nevertheless, that is what they wrote down. That is what she said. Before investigators had completed their work, before either person faced a trial, and before a jury ever heard evidence, the story already began spreading. The public reaction was immediate. News organizations across the country rushed to cover the bizarre details of this case. The story was shocking, unusual, and easily reduced to a simple headline. And that simplicity became part of the problem. The initial coverage largely focused on one fact: a crazy wife had injured her husband. The more complicated questions: what had happened inside their marriage, whether there had been a history of abuse, whether sexual assault had occurred, and how domestic violence was handled by the legal system, received far less attention than the first wave of reporting. The case became a cultural phenomenon almost overnight. Late night comedians began making jokes, tabloids competed for coverage, television programs debated the case, and Lorena Bobbitt, who had previously been unknown outside of her personal circle, had become one of the most recognizable names in America. Lorena went to work after the incident. She drove to the place where she felt the safest, which was the nail salon. She put the knife in a trash bin. She told police where it was, and they went to retrieve it. They were able to get to it before the garbage service could take it away. Then she went to her boss's house to seek comfort. She had always looked up to her boss, Jana, who owned multiple salons, who always seemed to help whenever she needed it. Jana hired her a lawyer, and she also hired a media manager, knowing that this case was going to get out of control. Unfortunately, hiring the media manager tipped off the newspapers that now she had a publicist, which meant she knew her name was going to be used. And unfortunately, the Washington Post was the first to publish her name. Now everyone knew who she was. Reporters hounded her all night. Geraldo would send her autographed pictures of him and would harass her on the phone. She just couldn't feel safe after everything. As the case moved forward, public opinion began forming long before the court proceedings began. Many people viewed Lorena only through the shocking details of this case. Others began asking why the years leading up to the incident were receiving so little attention. Domestic violence advocates pointed out that the national conversation was revealing a more troubling pattern. A woman's alleged abuse was often ignored until she responded in a way that society found impossible to ignore. The National Domestic Violence Hotline and other advocacy organizations later reflected on this case and as an example of how public conversations around intimate partner violence can become distorted when the most sensational detail replaces the larger story. The Bobbitt case became a turning point in discussions about domestic violence, victim responses, and media responsibility. The Commonwealth of Virginia now had two separate legal matters to address. First, John Bobbitt faced prosecution for allegations that he sexually assaulted Lorena before the incident. Second, Lorena faced prosecution for an injury that she caused to John. The order of those trials would have major impact on how the public understood the case. John's trial came first, and the question before the jury would be one that would be debated for years. Could a husband legally be accused of raping his wife? And the answer would not depend on public opinion, but on evidence presented in the courtroom. Inside the courtroom, the story became much more complicated. The first trial was not about the injury that made the international headlines. It was about an allegation that received far less attention in the weeks after June 24th. John Wayne Bobbitt was charged with marital sexual assault. The question before the court was whether John had sexually assaulted Lorena in the hours before the incident that brought the police to their apartment. Prosecutors argued that Lorena's account was supported by far more than the one incident of that night. The problem is, they did not allow her to talk about any of the history between her and John except 5 days prior to the night of the rape. So Lorena couldn't talk about all of these issues that they had in the past or that the police had been to their house numerous times. She couldn't talk about that this was the first time that he had ever assaulted her. Like, she couldn't talk about anything. And that made it very difficult because they needed supporting evidence and they didn't have it. They were trying to argue that June 1993 didn't happen just in a vacuum, but unfortunately their hands were tied to tell people about what had been going on. John Wayne Bobbitt's defense team disputed Lorena's allegations. They argued that the marriage was troubled, but that John wasn't guilty of sexual assault. John testified he had never forced himself on Lorena and denied all accusations against him. His attorneys challenged the credibility of any witnesses that supported Lorena's account and argued that the prosecution could not prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that a rape had happened. The defense also emphasized inconsistencies that they believed they found in the testimony. Outside of the courthouse, the trial became another chapter in a larger media spectacle. Television crews followed every development. Reporters analyzed testimony in real time. The public debate often became divided into two simple sides: those that saw John as a victim and those that saw Lorena as a victim. But the legal process requires something more complicated. The jury had to consider only the evidence presented in court. Again, without the past incidents, which is so fucked up. They were not trying to decide whether or not the marriage was healthy. They were deciding whether prosecutors had proven enough for that specific charge against John. On September 21st, 1993, after the trial lasted only 2 weeks, the jury found John Wayne Bobbitt not guilty of marital sexual assault. The acquittal did not mean that the jury had determined that nothing had happened inside their marriage. It meant prosecutors just did not have enough to bring that criminal charge beyond a reasonable doubt. John walked out of court, legally cleared of the accusation. The verdict also affected the public perception. Many people who had followed the case primarily through the headlines interpreted that result as proof that Lorena had lied. Others argued that the trial demonstrated the difficulty that many survivors face when trying to prove sexual violence, especially within a marriage. The divide that existed outside the courtroom remained. John walked out to the public clapping. Men saw this as a woman who took something integral to being a man, and women saw this as a defense from abuse. Now, with John's trial complete, attention immediately shifted to Lorena. She would face a jury, and this time it would all be televised. The charge was malicious wounding for the injury that she had caused John Wayne Bobbitt. And unlike John's trial, where the central question was whether an assault had occurred, Lorena's trial focused heavily on her mental state at the time of the incident. Now, hold on to your hats, because while awaiting the trial, John's lawyers instructed him to stay out of the public eye, to live quietly. I think they knew he was not necessarily a good guy. So they found a ranch in Texas for him to live and work on. However, he only stayed there a bit. John wanted limelight. In a documentary that I watched during my research, that I will talk about later, he bragged about having a lot of sex with a woman on the ranch. Just so gross, in my opinion. Then he told his lawyer that he was going to go to a John Wayne Bobbitt look-alike contest at a bar. They were pissed. They did not want him to do that. He left the ranch and started doing appearances at clubs and bars all over. He started selling t-shirts and making money off of the entire thing. He was selling autographs. In the press, Lorena was being portrayed as a hot-blooded Latina who got her revenge. It was fucking awful. Essentially, it went, as the kids say, viral. Obviously, that didn't exist yet. But SNL were doing skits on it. Late night hosts were telling a million jokes every single night. Comedians were talking about it. And then Howard Stern, not necessarily known as a great guy, right, had John on his New Year's Eve pageant party where he raised money for John Wayne Bobbitt. He had a telethon and raised a total of $190,000. They even used a penis as a dial to show you how much money was being raised. It was disgusting. John also met with the firefighters who found his penis and took photos with him. He was in the newspapers. He was out partying all the time. Like I said, his lawyers were pissed at this. They were not happy. He was constantly talking about the case. He was saying that Lorena was obsessive and jealous. And this was a problem because by the time Lorena entered the courtroom, many Americans had already made up their mind. And there was no way that the jury hadn't ever heard of this case. The image of Lorena had been shaped by tabloid covers and late night punchlines, but inside the courtroom, her attorneys were attempting to present a very different image. Not a caricature, not a headline, an actual human being. They argued that the incident was the result of severe psychological trauma and that years of alleged abuse had affected Lorena's ability to control her actions. The prosecution vehemently disagreed. They argued that Lorena knew what she was doing and should be held responsible. The jury would now have to decide, and the world was watching. The legal system had to examine the question that had been at the center of Lorena's defense. What was happening psychologically to a person who committed a violent act after years of alleged trauma? The trial was not whether or not Lorena had injured John. She admitted that she did that. The question was whether she legally was responsible for her actions at the moment they occurred. They argued that she had experienced a temporary period of insanity caused by the years of alleged physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. The defense presented witnesses who testified about Lorena's mental state. Psychiatrists and psychologists described what they believed was the impact of prolonged trauma. They argued that Lorena had experienced an emotional breakdown, that at the time of the incident, she wasn't able to fully understand the consequences of what she was doing. The defense also presented evidence about the marriage itself. They called witnesses who testified to Lorena's behavior before June 1993. Friends and coworkers described changes they had noticed. Some testified that Lorena had confided in them about the problems at home. Others saw signs of distress. They saw bruising. They saw her being withdrawn and quiet and scared. The defense's goal was to show the jury that the event was not an isolated moment between two strangers. It was at the end of a relationship that had been deteriorating for years. The prosecution brought out witnesses that testified that Lorena was obsessive, but these people were John's friends and his brother, who was also a hot mess. His brother was on a daytime talk show, and I'm pretty sure it was Geraldo, but he said that if he knew that she was also in the hospital the night of the incident, he would have killed her if he found her. He even said he drove around looking for her that night. I mean, if that doesn't tell you, that's his brother. The defense also showed countless pictures of police reports that showed Lorena being bruised, bruising around her neck, her arms, her face. Those had all been taken by police when they were called to the Bobbitt residence. This obviously was not a one-time issue. John was getting visibly confused and discombobulated when he was on the stand. It was clear he had been abusing Lorena for many years. He also admitted that he did hold her down at times and that he shoved her from time to time. But he said it was a defense because she was being the aggressor, that he would sit there and tell her it's not ladylike to hit. I mean, come on now. Then the prosecution brought up a document that he provided to family counseling when he was still at Quantico, and it was signed by him. In it, he stated that he regularly hit his wife. He claimed he did not remember signing that, but that it was his signature. I could go on with so many incidents of abuse and stories, but this podcast would take forever. When Lorena took the stand, she was emotional. She had to relive many of the abuses, describe what had happened in detail, being punched, beaten, raped, and verbally abused. It is really hard to hear her testimony. Then, some guys that played basketball in their neighborhood also testified to John telling them that he bragged about liking to make women scream, cry, and bleed, and that it was forced sex that turned him on. They said, quote, he liked making girls scream, and I swear a lot, but I hate saying this, and fucking them in the ass. I mean, that's the way he would talk to other men about what was going on in their house. So now, with all of this, public view was changing. People now saw what was really going on. Women's groups started getting involved, and the Hispanic community really rallied around Lorena. Over 100 people daily would be standing outside in the sweltering heat protesting. Lorena said it really helped her not to feel so alone during the trial. Remember, the question is not if she committed this act, but that she was experiencing an irresistible impulse or temporary insanity. Her fear was real. The history of abuse and violence was real. Then came the news that the day before the incident, Lorena had tried to file for a protective order against John. She went to the office to file, and the clerk told her that the secretary who would submit the file was out of the office and to come back tomorrow. She felt backed in a corner, and no one was helping her. She was trying to get help. You can see why she's at a breaking point. Psychiatrists said that she had PTSD and depressive disorder, and here's where a big break came, because the prosecution psychiatrist was saying she was in her right mind when the incident occurred. Definitely there had been abuse in the past. But then they bring in a witness who was a client from the nail salon. She testified to seeing Lorena have a panic attack. The woman noticed that she had bruises on her wrists and arms and asked her about them. Lorena confided in her that her husband hurt her, and that's why she was visibly upset that day. She said that she was trembling and that her husband had told her he was going to throw her off the railing of their apartment and tell people that she jumped. The woman urged her to get help and even offered her own home as a refuge that day. Lorena said he would kill her and also killing anyone that helped her. She was scared for Lorena, but knew you can't force someone to leave. Part of knowing this established that Lorena felt like she had no way out. The state psychiatrist, who had originally said he thought she was in her right mind during this time, changed his testimony after hearing that woman. He agreed she had PTSD and supported that she had irresistible impulse that day. This is a pivotal moment. Now, here's the part that I had no clue about, and I learned this from the documentary that I listened to. The client who testified said that she did not know about the first trial, and she wished she did because that would have helped change the entire case. But only after seeing the press after the first trial, she saw a video of Lorena walking outside the courthouse and recognized her as the woman from that day at the salon. She called the courthouse immediately and said, I have information. I need to talk to someone. They referred her to an attorney, but he was John's attorney. Now, This is where it gets interesting because John's attorney was also working that first trial. He knew John was a dirtbag. This is my opinion. I think he knew. He knew he was an abuser. He gave her the phone number to the defense. So he gave her the phone number of the lawyer that's defending Lorena on trial. So then he knew that that person was going to be brought up and it would probably change this entire case. Now, the client tells you about it in the documentary, but when they question the lawyer about it, he just smirks. So he doesn't tell that he was the one that passed on the information to bring groundbreaking testimony into the courtroom. But he definitely was the catalyst for it, in my opinion. So after 7.5 hours, the jury finds Lorena Bobbitt not guilty by reason of insanity. And at the moment, she thought, oh my gosh, I finally made it through this. I'm free. But remember, she wasn't charged criminally for the crime, but she was not free. They took her immediately to a state mental hospital for evaluation and treatment for 45 days. You have to do that if you are found not guilty by reason of insanity. They said it was quite disruptive at the hospital with helicopters flying above and reporters calling nonstop. Barbara Walters actually showed up outside the hospital, banging the door down, trying to get in, saying, I am going to have an interview with Lorena Bobbitt today. I am going to do this because I have interviewed kings and world leaders, and I will not be held back from interviewing her. However, Lorena refused to talk to anyone from the media. They were relentless. In the hospital, Lorena really did the hard work. She leaned on her religious beliefs and started to find peace again. After treatment, she continued healing. Now, both trials have ended. Lorena and John move in very different directions. Lorena attempted to rebuild a private life. At one point, she did try to sell her story because she needed to make some money after everything that had gone on. And then she found out that Jana, the person who hired the media representative and the lawyer, was going to try to take a large percentage of her story. So she did not move forward with that. Eventually, later on, she did, but not at the time. And her and Jana don't speak anymore because that was kind of shitty to try to profit off of your friend's horrible abuse story. Anyways, the unusual nature of this case created opportunities for John, and he meant to profit off of his notoriety. John Wayne Bobbitt continued to do lots of interviews, public appearances. He stripped while judging a Lorena lookalike contest, which I think is so fucking gross. He famously did a porn called John Wayne Bobbitt Uncut, and they even did a huge Hollywood screening for it. He was told he was going to get a percentage of the film. However, he totally got screwed, no pun intended, and he got nothing at all. So good for him. But it is still one of the highest grossing adult films of all time. And I think mostly for the morbid curiosity of what his penis looked like afterward. Anyway, he also formed an unsuccessful band called Severed Parts. Gross. Fuck. I can't even with this man. But he had no money. He spent all of his money on partying and having a good time. And that meant that he had to file for bankruptcy. Filing for bankruptcy meant that he also did not pay his hospital bill for his reattachment surgery. It's so messed up. In the meantime, he has other assault charges, lots of convictions. He remarries a shit ton of times. He starts officiating weddings in Las Vegas. He even gets a penis extension, which was completely botched. And then he did another porn movie called Frankenpenis. You cannot make this shit up. The surgery was so bad that his surgeon had his license revoked. Like they fucked up his shit. He made appearances on WWE Monday Night Wrestling. He made lots of intermittent media appearances on Howard Stern again several times, at clubs and parties, etc. He also did a stint as a knife thrower in the Jim Rose Circus. The thing is John was not very smart, and they talk about that a lot in everything I've ever read. He just really couldn't retain information for doing jobs, or he had no want to, so he didn't care. I don't know. He tried being a celebrity greeter at the Bunny Ranch in Nevada, which is famous for its brothel. And they said they tried to train him as a bartender, but he just couldn't seem to figure it out or retain anything. The women that worked there hated him. He thought he was a huge celebrity, and he would constantly spend time with all of the people that were there or whip his dick out a lot. And they were like, "You're not the star here. You're trying to get our girls to make more money. Like, what the fuck?" Anyway, he famously shoplifted $150,000 worth of clothing, which he would return and try to get back for cash. He was obviously arrested for that. There were more assault charges, more harassment charges from other partners. There's even one woman who claimed he had kidnapped her for 3 days and held her. It was a long term partner of his. He had lots of stints in jail. And all this time, he still claims that he never abused anyone. His rap sheet just goes on and on and on. Nowadays, John Wayne Bobbitt is a hardcore mega supporter, Trump supporter, and he lives on disability after a severe car accident and health issues. Now, after the trials, Lorena steps away from the spotlight as much as she can, right? You can't fully get away from it. It was enormous. She eventually goes back to using her birth name, Lorena Gallo. And unlike John, she did not want to build a public identity. Instead, she focused on rebuilding. She became involved in advocacy work relating to domestic violence and education. Through the years, she spoke publicly about her experiences, not to revisit the sensational details, but to discuss the issues that she believed were overlooked. She founded the Lorena Gallo Foundation, an organization focused on raising awareness about domestic violence and supporting survivors and their families. Her message was that the public should not wait until a situation reaches a crisis point before taking abuse seriously. She has since remarried and found happiness, and good for her. But now, in a strange and shocking update, John is still contacting Lorena via social media. He sends her countless letters to her jobs. He emails her. He tells her that he misses her, that he still loves her, and he calls her his wife in each one of these letters. He signs some of them, "Your cold, insensitive husband." He tells her that he's always thinking about her, and there's literally hundreds of emails and letters. His messages also say that it would be great if they could get back together so they can do interviews and make a lot of money and probably have a baby for attention with the media. I mean, what the fuck? He also said he believed it would be the ultimate love story if they got back together. Ugh. So, the documentary series that I keep mentioning, it was produced by filmmaker Jordan Peele. The series examined not only what had happened between John and Lorena, but how the media covered the story. For many viewers, it was the first time they had ever seen this case presented through this different lens. The documentary explored how the public consumed the story for entertainment and how surrounding conversations about abuse and gender had often been ignored. It didn't erase the complexity of the case. Instead, it asked viewers to reconsider what they thought they already knew. It is excellent. I highly recommend it. But one thing I wanted to mention at the end of that, Lorena is talking about all the letters and the emails, and John is being interviewed saying how much he loves her and he wished they got back together, etc. And she looks at the camera and she says, "Just leave me alone. I cut his penis off. Leave me alone." And for fucking real, like, I don't get it, but this is also part of the cycle of abuse. He's love bombing and then, he would go back to the same ways. He has a history of violence. We have seen it. Anyway, the thing about this case is that it started a national dialogue about domestic violence. For women, they saw it as something affected one of us can affect us all. And women led the fight to change the laws to protect themselves. Sadly, there were other things that were happening. I think right afterward was Skategate with Nancy Kerrigan and Tanya Harding, and that just took over the tabloid culture of that time. And it wasn't until another famous murder case, which was the O.J. Simpson and Nicole Brown murder case, that things really started to change. And in 1995, the Violence Against Women Act was finally passed. We continue to fight for women's rights so no one feels like they don't have a way out. If you or anyone you know is a victim of domestic violence, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. My sources for this case were the National Domestic Violence Hotline, ABC News, A&E Crime Central, the New York Times, Oxygen, People Magazine, court reporting and trial coverage from 1993 to 1994, legal analysis of John Wayne Bobbitt and Lorena Bobbitt's trials, and the documentary Lorena, produced by Jordan Peele. I mean, this one I just feel like is so prolific. It's one we all know, but there were things that I found out in my research that I had no idea about. Of course, I knew about that she had been abused, but I did not know a lot of the intricacies that also went along with this. So, if you do get a chance and you want to do a deep dive, there is so much more evidence that I didn't even talk about because it is so vast. The level of abuse and specific incidents that they talk about throughout the case is crazy. Her testimony is heartbreaking and it is so hard to watch. As you can see, she is traumatized in reliving this. The clips that they show of the late night hosts and all of that, I vividly remember seeing it like in real time. And the fact that John is still out there trying to profit off of this horrific incident, I mean, his rap sheet goes on and on and on for abuse and violence against women. It's just horrific. Anyways, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to me by myself. I'll be back with Autumn next week. New episodes come out on Tuesdays, so make sure to look out for those. If you do want to follow us on social media, we are at Murder Not Murdering on Instagram. We are also mnm.pod on TikTok, and we have a subreddit. So do go and check those things out. We always love to hear from you. If you'd like to tell us of cases you'd like us to cover, let us know. We do really appreciate that. And, if you have a connection to a case that you want to tell us, please slide into those DMs. Anyways, thank you again for listening. New episodes out Tuesday. We appreciate you. This is Murder Not Murdering with Erin, and Autumn will be back next week. Bye.